Imagine dropping your 6-year-old daughter off at daycare in the morning, believing she is going to school just like any other day. You say goodbye, you watch her walk inside, and then you leave, expecting to see her again later that afternoon. But hours later, instead of your child coming home, you receive the phone call every parent fears. Your daughter is dead. 6-year-old Winter Jones was supposed to be transported from Kid University Daycare in Cordova, Tennessee, to Macon Hall Elementary School. Instead, investigators are now trying to determine how a 6-year-old child ended up alone inside a daycare vehicle for hours during extreme summer heat. And perhaps the most disturbing question of all is this: how did nobody realize she was still there? This is the tragic story of Winter Jones. And before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Crime Autopsy. We examine the details behind tragic and disturbing cases, separating what is known from what is still unanswered. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us until the end, and I want to hear from you. After hearing the facts of this case, tell me in the comments, what do you think should have happened to make sure Winter was accounted for? Let's begin. It was Thursday, August 13, 2026. The day began like an ordinary morning for Winter Jones and her family. Winter was 6 years old. According to her family, she was autistic and nonverbal. Her loved ones described her as a child who enjoyed singing, dancing, swimming, and playing with stuffed animals. She had a personality. She had interests. She had people who loved her. And she had an entire future ahead of her. That morning, Winter's father, Bryan Jones, dropped his daughter off at Kid University Daycare in Cordova. There was nothing to suggest that this would be the last time he would see her alive. Winter was expected to be transported to Macon Hall Elementary School, but somewhere between that morning drop-off and the afternoon, something went terribly wrong. According to reports, Winter apparently remained inside the daycare vehicle instead of being accounted for after the transportation route. And she would remain there for hours. Think about that for a moment. A 6-year-old child was supposed to be transported from a daycare facility to school. There should have been multiple opportunities to realize she was missing. Someone should know which children boarded the vehicle. Someone should know which children got off. Someone should know which children arrived at their destination. And someone should know whether any child remained inside the vehicle when the route ended. But somehow, Winter was apparently left behind, and the clock kept ticking. Outside, temperatures were approaching 97 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside an enclosed vehicle, temperatures can become significantly more dangerous, especially under direct sunlight. A vehicle doesn't need to be running for its interior to become deadly. The heat can build rapidly, and for a small child, prolonged exposure can become catastrophic. Winter was not simply waiting somewhere uncomfortable. She was trapped in an environment that could become lethal. And according to her father, her body temperature had reached approximately 109 degrees Fahrenheit when she died. That figure has been reported as information provided by the family, and the official medical examiner's findings are still important for establishing the precise medical circumstances. But regardless of the exact number, there is no question that extreme heat was at the center of this tragedy. And there was another factor that makes this case even more heartbreaking. Winter was reportedly nonverbal. She could not simply walk into an office and tell an adult what had happened. She could not call her parents. She could not explain that she had been left behind. She depended on the adults around her to keep track of her. That makes the question of accountability even more important. Because when a child cannot advocate for herself, the responsibility falls even more heavily on the adults entrusted with her safety. Hours passed, and nobody apparently realized that Winter was still inside the vehicle. Then came the afternoon. The daycare vehicle was being prepared for its afternoon route, and that's when Winter was discovered. She was found unresponsive. An emergency call was made at approximately 3:23 p.m. Emergency personnel rushed her to Baptist Children's Hospital, but it was too late. Winter Jones had died. A 6-year-old girl who had been dropped off that morning was now gone. And for her family, the nightmare was only beginning. Because once the shock of her death began to sink in, an even more painful question emerged. How could this happen? How could a child enter a daycare transportation system in the morning and remain inside a vehicle for hours without anyone realizing she was missing. The investigation now has to reconstruct those missing hours. Who was responsible for the vehicle? Who was responsible for the children? Was a child count performed? Was Winter's absence noticed at school? Was the daycare's attendance record checked? Was the vehicle inspected after returning to the facility? And perhaps most importantly, was there a procedure designed to make sure no child was left behind? These aren't accusations. They're questions investigators must answer, because we still don't have the complete picture. Memphis police began investigating the circumstances surrounding Winter's death. Tennessee authorities also became involved, including the state's child care authorities. And the investigation could potentially determine whether any regulations or laws were violated. Reports indicate Tennessee child care facilities have transportation safety requirements involving monitoring devices, vehicle checks, and daily logs. That makes the investigation into what happened that morning even more significant. If those safeguards existed, investigators will need to determine whether they were followed. And if they were followed, investigators will need to understand how Winter could still have been left inside the vehicle. Meanwhile, Winter's family was left trying to understand how their little girl could be gone. Her father, Bryan Jones, spoke publicly about his daughter. He described a child who loved to sing, dance, swim, and play with stuffed animals. To everyone else, this may be a developing investigation. To her family, Winter was not a headline. She was their daughter, their niece, their loved one, a little girl with a future. Her uncle, Christopher Jones, also spoke about the devastating impact her death had on the family. And there is one detail that makes the timeline particularly difficult to understand. Winter was not reportedly discovered immediately after the vehicle returned. She was discovered hours later when the vehicle was being prepared for the afternoon route. That means there was a period during which the vehicle was apparently sitting at the daycare while Winter remained inside. And that raises another critical question. Was there an end-of-route inspection? Because if someone had physically checked the vehicle after the morning route, would Winter have been found sooner? Again, that is something investigators, not internet commentators, must establish. And this is where we have to be careful. There are already people online demanding arrests and assigning blame. But at this stage, no one should be declared criminally responsible simply because something terrible happened. The investigation needs evidence, records, transportation logs, surveillance footage, witness statements, attendance records, vehicle information, medical evidence, and the exact timeline. Those details could tell investigators what happened during the hours between Winter's arrival and the moment she was discovered. And there is another question that deserves attention. Where was Winter supposed to be? She was reportedly expected to go to Macon Hall Elementary School. If she never arrived, when did someone realize she was absent? Was the school notified? Did anyone contact the daycare? Did anyone contact her family? How was her absence recorded? These questions could become extremely important as investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. Because this case isn't simply about what happened inside a vehicle. It's about the entire chain of responsibility surrounding a child. A child enters daycare. A child is placed on transportation. A child is supposed to arrive at school. A child should be accounted for. And eventually that same child is discovered unresponsive inside the vehicle. Somewhere in that chain, something failed. The investigation now has to determine exactly what. And there is one question that may ultimately define this entire case. Was Winter's death the result of a tragic mistake, a breakdown in multiple safety procedures, or something more serious? We don't know yet. But the answers could determine whether anyone is held legally responsible. And as investigators continue examining the case, Winter's family is left with something no parent should ever have to experience. A child's room without the child, a future that will never happen, and memories that now hurt more than they comfort. Winter Jones was only 6 years old. She had barely begun her life, and on August 13th, she was supposed to spend another ordinary day learning, playing, and growing up. Instead, she died after being left inside a daycare vehicle during extreme heat. But the story doesn't end with her death, because now comes the investigation. Who was responsible for making sure Winter was safe? What procedures were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy? Were those procedures followed? And if they were not, what happens next? In part 2, We'll examine the unanswered timeline, the daycare's responsibilities, the Tennessee safety requirements, the investigation, what authorities have and have not said about possible charges, and the questions Winter's family deserves answers to. Before you leave, tell me what you think. If a daycare is transporting children, how many separate safety checks should happen before a vehicle is considered empty? And do you believe every child should be physically accounted for before the driver leaves the vehicle? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe Winter's story deserves to be remembered, not just as another tragic headline, share this video. Subscribe to Crime Autopsy for Part 2 and more carefully researched crime stories. Because sometimes the most important part of a case isn't just asking what happened, it's asking how it was allowed to happen, and who was supposed to prevent it. This is the story of Winter Jones, and the questions surrounding her final hours are still waiting for answers. The death of 6-year-old Winter Jones leaves behind a heartbreaking question that investigators now have to answer. How did a child who was supposed to be transported safely from daycare to school end up spending hours inside a vehicle in extreme heat? And perhaps even more importantly, how many opportunities were there to find her before it was too late?